University. Today's discussion is being hosted by Issues, and I am really happy to introduce today's discussion, How Did Science Become So Polarizing? Before I introduce the speakers and the moderator, let me first thank everyone, you, for joining us. Issues events are an opportunity to have a large, multi-leveled conversation involving the panelists and the moderator and the audience. About half of today's event will be a moderated discussion between the panelists, and the other half will be the panel engaging with the questions that you, the audience, ask and the issues that you feel are interesting and important. To enter your questions, use the Q&A function. And at the same time, you in the audience can also use the chat function to chat amongst yourselves. Please use the Q&A to communicate with the moderator, and we will publish both a video and a chat transcript on our site after the event, and we will also mail it out to you. So let's get started. Our moderator today is Tori Bosch. She's the first opinion editor at Stat News. And our panelists are Carrie Funk, Senior Advisor, Aspen Institute for Science and Society Program. Emily Garner, Senior Analyst at Lake Research Partners. Tony Mills, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Technology, Science and Energy at the American Enterprise Institute. And Toby Smith, Senior Vice President for Government Relations and Public Policy, Association of American Universities. Okay, I'm turning this over to Tori. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me today. Really grateful to Lisa and the entire team at Issues, which is such an indispensable publication, for hosting this really important conversation. I'd like to kick it off by turning to Tony Mills and asking you, Tony, to share the 2 to 4 sentence elevator pitch for the article you recently published in Issues in Science and Technology, which is sort of the foundation for this conversation today.
Sure. Thanks, Tori. And thank you also to Lisa and to Issues, not only for the opportunity to publish the article you mentioned, Tori, but to participate in this discussion. I really do think Issues in Science and Technology is a bright spot in public discourse on science and technology today. And I would say that even if I didn't publish there. So the basic idea is that, first to start, that we have a real, I would not hesitate to use the language of crisis, a kind of crisis of public confidence or trust in this current moment. I think that claim is a little less controversial now than when even my colleague Price St. Clair and I began writing the piece. I like to say that prior to COVID, there was a lively debate among scholars about whether talk of crisis was alarmist or not. During and after COVID, we kind of moved into a different frame of mind, which was clearly something's gone wrong. And I think now we're in a sort of third phase, if you like, where I think we all recognize that something has gone badly awry with the relationship of the public to science and vice versa. And so what we try to do in this piece is to argue that the prevailing explanations for what has gone wrong fail. And we look at 2. One is the idea that those who are distrustful, who express distrust in science or scientists, lack adequate information. This is sometimes called the deficit model. It's widely discredited among scholars, but it's very prevalent among mainstream institutions. And we argue that trust is a relational concept. It calls for repair, not more information. The second prevailing explanation essentially blames conservative political ideology and sees the problem of distrust as stemming from a particular view, a political view of the role of the state and an antipathy to federal regulation. And we argue that this view, which is, I think, much more widely accepted in the scholarly literature, also fails. And I think it fails, we can go into the detail later if you like, but roughly speaking, I think that like the deficit model explanation, it puts the blame on everyone other than scientific institutions. It's an argument that the public has gone awry, or some swath of the public is in error, and it's the role of expert institutions to correct their beliefs. And I think that this is a dangerous standpoint for these institutions to take strategically and politically. And I think it's wrong on the merits. I think the second piece of this is that this explanation, in my view, really obscures the dynamics that we saw playing out during COVID, where the pro-industry, pro-government kind of binary just doesn't seem to work very well. And I think it really doesn't explain the larger shifts that we are seeing in our politics and culture. And so part of what we're trying to do is situate the discussion around trust in science and the polarization of trust in science in the context of these larger socioeconomic and cultural shifts, and then offer an alternative explanation, which maybe we can get into a little bit.
Yeah, so I thank you for that. I'd like to spend the first half, maybe a little less than half of our time, just talking about the problems that Tony has just laid out, sort of the diagnosis, if you will, what we're actually seeing, how bad the problem is. And then from there, I'd like to segue into talking more about what we do about it. So the treatment, so to speak, since I come from a healthcare publication. To help us kind of get the lay of the land, Emily, I was hoping that since you and your colleagues have done some work to survey people about trust in science, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of what the landscape looks like.
Yeah, and a lot of this is covered in the article, which was very good, of course. But so there's absolutely, we're seeing a divergence on trust in science. It's very polarized by party. I don't think that this is very surprising information to anyone. I do think it's important to note that science is coming from a place of being quite trusted as far as institutions go. So you're looking at still like around 3/4 of the public that does have what we would consider to be baseline trust in science. Maybe not a great deal of trust, but at least trust in science. So when we're talking about growing polarization and crisis, those terms are relative, and we're doing so from a place of an institution that starts at a pretty high level of trust. But from there, it's undeniable that we're seeing a shift. And that's concerning because when we see shifts like this happen in the past, climate change is one that I think a lot of people are familiar with and feel like we can probably identify many, many examples that you see of the way that views on climate change have become polarized. That's not something that we have seen really revert. So these kinds of big shifts appear to be pretty permanent. They're very difficult to unentrench. And that's why these kinds of conversations are important. And COVID is absolutely, it looks like an example of a similar scale of shift in the type of divergence that we're seeing by party, especially, and how it's affected views on science as a whole, but particularly certain subsets like the entirety of public health and vaccination.
And Carrie, you've also been doing some work to sort of figure out what a lack of trust looks like. How is it manifesting exactly here?
Um, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wanted to echo a little bit of what both Emily and Tony said, but with my own twist here. I mean, one of the reasons, there's two reasons why we're talking about being more polarized over science. And one has to do with a growth in the share of people, primarily Republicans, who are expressing negative trust in scientists to act in the best interests of the public. As Emily said, it's not a majority. It's not even a majority of Republicans. So we don't want to overstate that. But the reason we're here is not because of majorities. It's because of the growth in, kind of a deep skepticism around science and scientists. The second way in which we're more polarized, which I think we're also kind of referencing but not saying outright, is because essentially we've become our politics is more correlated with more aspects of science. 10 years ago, we were studying people's attitudes across a range of science issues, and we would talk about how some issues in science were correlated with party and a lot of issues weren't. Now, we're just seeing more overlap, particularly because of COVID-19, because of the divisions over how every aspect of the outbreak was handled. What you're seeing now is kind of a scientists in one bucket, where medical scientists and public health had been kind of more separated. There was more bipartisan agreement over all sorts of issues and trust in those groups. And so now you see this bigger divide. So I'm going to stop there and let someone else chime in.
Yeah, one thing that stood out to me in Tony's article and issues was that much of the problem here is trust, not exactly about people, though people certainly play a role, but in institutions. That the problem here is that scientific institutions often seem, you write, insensitive, unresponsive, or even hostile to their priorities and concerns. And when we're talking about those institutions, I think it's clear that many of them are, in fact, universities. So, Toby, I was hoping that you could weigh in a little bit on the perspective of what the diminishment of trust in science has meant for America's research universities. And then we'll open it up to more general chatter.
Sure. Let me start by just making an observation, because we're talking about the increased polarization of science. You need to understand that part of that is driven by the increased polarization of the country overall, starting with Congress, that we have, and I attribute this largely, I mean, we did that kind of to ourselves because we gerrymandered districts such that we made it easier for one party or the other to win. And so we've gone from, you go back to when Bill Clinton was elected, it was over 100 swing districts. Now we're down to, I think, around 40, 35, depends on which election, presidential election. But so you don't have that much competition. But the other thing is we've seen this increased polarization of the American people. Why? Well, I always say Walter Cronkite was in my news. When I grew up, everybody trusted Walter Cronkite. Now you can go and get your news sources from, if you're conservative, you watch Fox. If you're more lean Democratic, you watch MSNBC. And if you want to see just people argue, I argue it's CNN these days because they just have talking heads arguing all the time and back and forth. So let's put that in the context then of what that means for science. First of all, in the congressional piece, we're electing more. More people are elected in the primary. So, and even presidential, you want to cater to your base. I was always taught, no, after the primary, presidential candidates will move to the middle. That's not the way it's working these days. For science, that makes it tough because science, traditionally in a Congress where you don't have more moderates, ideologues come to Congress with their minds made up. And so do people who align with particular parties. So if they're getting fed certain information about what science says, what to believe and what not, they tend to believe that. They tend to align good science with what aligns with their ideology. Now let's go to the institution piece. One of the challenges too is these breakdowns. From my perspective, if you look at the polarization of the country, it's very much rural, urban, and then suburban. Suburban are where those swing districts are that I mentioned. I look at where the institutions I represent are primarily located. They're located in urban, suburban areas, not so many in the rural areas. But if you look at this last election, 84% of US counties, which are land large, maybe people sparse, 84%, a majority of people voted for Donald Trump. 14% they voted for Harris. Only 7 of the institutions I represent are in those counties that voted for Trump in those 84%. So there is a divide geographically too. And one of the challenges that we face is the anti-institution. There's a very good book, Catherine Kramer from Wisconsin has written about the politics of resentment, in the rise of Scott Walker in Wisconsin. It's worth reading because I think it starts to explain the resentment towards institutions, particularly those like whether it's big companies or those in Washington, D.C., or our institutions like universities, that resentment that's out there amongst the general population. So.
Yeah, and when we say a lack of trust in institutions and science, what does that look like specifically for anybody to answer?
Well, I'll just chime in a couple of points. I mean, one is I think part of what Toby's pointing out is the long roots of what's happening. Certainly COVID accelerated all these things, but every divide in society has longer roots than 3, 4, 5 years. And so that's part of what's going on is in terms of, our own sorts, in our own big sort into communities, into urban rural communities, into highly educated, less educated communities, into religious, kind of Christian religious communities, and kind of agnostic, not practicing communities. So we're doing that in all sorts of ways. So the people are these kind of identities are becoming intertwined. In terms of institutions, I blame myself for not paying enough attention to how intertwined our views of scientists are with science institutions. And who are the science institutions? Primarily government and universities. There was one panel like this where we talked about kind of higher ed and the kind of divisions over higher ed and how that might be relevant for those of us interested in the science community. But pretty much one conversation, we weren't talking about it enough, even though it's been going on since at least 2018. So we weren't paying enough attention to that. And now, of course, it's crystal clear to us how these kind of concerns and resentments have grown to the point where we really need these efforts to start bridging divides.
Tori, can I jump in here? So echoing a lot of what's been said, I think Carrie's point about COVID accelerating rather than creating a lot of these trends is important. But maybe, I don't know if I'm pushing back or just offering a kind of a different perspective that I think is maybe missing here. So I completely agree with Toby that the importance of institutions and the dynamics around distrust of institutions is key. And so I think while Emily is absolutely right that we have to keep in mind the baseline from which we're talking about trust and distrust in science, I think we can also situate this in a wider context where we have seen secular declines in major societal institutions. Science has been relatively impervious to that over time in the past few decades. But I think increasingly these things are interconnected. And so I think something that, in my view, happens, or at least used to happen too often in the discourse around trust in science, is to treat it as abstracted from the social contexts and institutions in which science operates. And I think that's increasingly clear that that's not the right way to go. But if we think about that context, I just want to point to two things that I think are important. One is the shift, and we talk about this in our piece, the shifting nature of the political parties, and in particular, the importance of education polarization as interconnected with these large-scale sorting shifts that Toby was talking about, and a growing perception, which I think tracks a reality, that, to put it bluntly, the Democratic Party is the party of institutions, and the Republican Party is the party that's skeptical of institutions. So I think two things are really striking here. One, while we can look historically at moments when we've seen these dynamics play out before, I think it's harder to find cases where we've polarized so starkly around those issues within the two parties. Whereas, in the past, you might find an anti-institutional strain within the Democratic Party or within the Republican Party. And the second is, it's not as simple as saying that the two parties have flipped, but there's something to that. And I think that the rise to prominence of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is emblematic of this. And so when we talk about these longer trends, these secular trends, when we talk about rural distrust and the backlash against universities, I think sometimes we talk as if it's been a continual development since the 70s or 80s. And this is part of what we were trying to counter in our piece. I think in a certain way, we're entering a new kind of paradigm. And the Republican Party, if you look, even just go back to pre-2008, the survey data show a very different trend. In fact, Republicans tend to express higher level trust of science and trust in science than Democrats. Of course, this varies over time and so forth. But this phenomenon that we're talking about is relatively recent. And in some ways, it actually reverses historical patterns and trends. And so I think part of what we have to do is come to terms with those larger changes, which are unfortunately really complicated. And so therefore, hard to address.
Well, please go ahead.
I totally agree with Tony that I think both points are true, and that in some ways we're always talking about trends, but I do think it's important to acknowledge COVID as a flashpoint that has really kind of taken things in a different direction for the worst in many ways that we're concerned with. And then as to the question of what, I believe your original question was what we mean when we're talking about trust in science to some extent. I think there's a dimension that we haven't quite hit on yet, where we've talked about science as how does it relate to institutions, which is very closely, I think. But there's more to it than that. There's science, and then there's scientists, there's scientific institutions. And what we've seen so far is that a people forward approach, like you're always going to have the highest numbers with that. So like you have more trust among the public in scientists than you have in scientific institutions. And when we dig even deeper into that, you see that those high numbers, that we see that high baseline that we were talking about in trust in science, is based a lot in trust that scientists are competent and that they are trying to do the right thing. But the low numbers, the numbers that we see really driving these divides, tend to come from skepticism that scientists are accurately reading their own biases, that they're addressing their own biases, and that they share the values of the public. And I think that's really important to come back to when we're talking about solutions, because a lot of the time, I think the scientific community is really driven towards presenting information and educating. And what we need to do often in messaging is thinking about, well, are you signaling to this person that you share their values?
And what does that look like exactly? This is a great time, I think, to pivot to the part of our conversation where we talk about how to treat this problem that we've diagnosed. So we've talked about engagement, we've talked about people versus institutions. I do think, though, that there's this real challenge in which scientists and policymakers and others, as Tony writes and as has been referenced here, want to just focus on the facts, that the facts should fix things. But we've seen research that shows that presenting facts doesn't work. In fact, sometimes it can get people to re-entrench further in their position. So where does productive engagement start, and what does unproductive engagement look like?
Tori, can I start by answering? It starts with, I think there's a huge need for the scientific community to listen first and talk second. And too often, the scientific community has talked first. Here are the facts. And based upon the facts, here's what you should do. And that comes across in a not so positive way often. I also think there's a failure. I actually tend to believe that there's good news and bad news. A lot of people still believe in science, but they align what's a credible scientist with the scientist that takes a more ideological perspective that aligns with their beliefs, which now are more polarized, as we've just discussed, than ever before. So the outlier scientist might be seen as the credible scientist to folks depending on their belief system. So if the consensus isn't conveyed in a way that people can understand, and the other thing is tapping into people's values and understanding what those are and starting there when we talk about what science means and why things matter. The other thing is, I do think sometimes scientists overplay their hand in that science has a political solution. And science doesn't. I mean, science is a set of facts. The politics around what you do, or the policy, is ultimately a value decision. And there is no right policy based upon the science. I think that's a challenge, that scientists often think that the policy is, science says this is the right policy. With COVID, it's a perfect example. There's a balancing act, because you had to close down schools if you follow the public health prescription, but maybe that wasn't so good for education. There was science around that too, but maybe we didn't pay as much attention to the impact it would have on learning. And a lot of people still, we're incredibly frustrated by that. And I don't think we listened enough to those parents who were upset that their kids weren't going to school.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I think it's an incredibly important point that the public is very divided on whether they think that scientists should be making policy. That is one of the main points where you see polarization and divergence. And it's not a point to ignore. I would agree completely that there is no scientific policy. Science is one of the consideration that goes into policy making. And I think some of the backlash that we saw to communication around COVID came from putting our scientists out there as messengers for policy and having them deliver policy. And that politicized them, and it politicized science as a whole.
Yes. And while we're going backwards, I would just also add that there are times in which scientists need to be more clear about their goals. They present this evidence, but they're not always explicit about this is what I would recommend if your goal is to save as many lives as possible. But of course, during COVID, we were balancing a bunch of different goals. And so we needed to be a little more explicit about that. The other piece that I would mention is so many times we're discussing these things around areas of what they call consensus science. But there's all sorts of other science. And so we need to be always thinking about that full range. Not every issue even has a consensus. So we need to be talking about how hard that is to explore the uncertainty in science and the changing evidence over time. So that's just 2 points.
At the risk of vigorously agreeing with everybody and having all of us just agree on this point, I wanted to just add, I think one of the things that COVID did, I think, is clearly illustrate that even when we have robust science, there are a range of policy options that are reasonably consistent with science. If you think about a wider range of, I mean, sometimes even consistent with the goals that the scientific community itself would like to pursue, but especially when you factor in a wider range of goals and interests. I think a clear example of this was that, Toby mentioned media fragmentation, but even if, you don't have to go to, you didn't have to during COVID go to fringe sources to find out that different countries, even Western democracies, had different policies around things like masking and school closures. And what you see as you're a member of the public is, does the UK have different science than we have in the United States? So clearly, policy and science can be relatively loosely coupled. And the way in which scientists were put forward or put themselves forward as the face for policy, I think part of the reason that invited this politicization was just the contrast between that and the reality on the ground that most people had access to, just seeing the diversity of decisions that were made, even just within the United States. The other thing I wanted to just add is values are really tricky because we don't agree about them. And so I think the way I would put it is that it's not simply that scientists or expert scientific institutions have to ask whether they are signaling that they share values with the wider public, because maybe they don't share values with the relevant members of the wider public. That's okay. We live in a pluralistic society. I think the point is to recognize and respect differences of value. And to do that does require having an awareness of the diversity of values and opinions that exist. But it comes at the risk of sacrificing scientists' monopoly on that discourse, because scientists may have a superior epistemic claim about a given scientific issue. But if we're talking about conflicts between values, scientists are just citizens like anybody else.
So shockingly, we are already almost halfway through today's event. So I want to make sure we can get to a few more points before we start the question portion. One that came up in Tony's article and has also come up elsewhere is the fact that scientists, as polling suggests, generally lean toward the Democratic Party. I'm curious whether any of you see any ideas on how to diversify politically in an institution, in something we're seeing a lot of discourse about, especially within universities right now. Is there a way to, I don't want to call it affirmative action for Republicans, but is there a way to attract more conservatives to science? And will that actually make a difference?
I think that's quite difficult because you're in a kind of chicken and an egg situation where as much as we're seeing Republicans move away from science, it's a reorganization where people who are not drawn to science are moving towards the Republican Party. I would pivot a little bit and say that I don't know that I think that that is necessarily the solution to what we are talking about here. I think ultimately the goal is to depoliticize science, as difficult as that is, to the extent possible. And to that end, it doesn't really matter how many scientists are Democrats when the goal is to produce good science and, to be figuring out how to communicate transparently about what the drawbacks are in the science, what we do know, what we don't know. And then when we're thinking about things like policy, how to decouple policy decisions from pure science and how to communicate, to go back to what Tony was saying, absolutely true, everything about, pluralistic society. But when we think about like public health messaging and, okay, we have to talk to everybody, I think we need so much more research in this area, but the research that we have done specifically on vaccines, which we've been doing pretty consistently, messaging research since about 2020, the stuff that you see is more successful in terms of messaging, grounds the elements of vaccination that people trust most, so like childhood vaccines that they are most familiar with, in values that are most broadly shared, like living in a safe society, having, our kids be able to be safe at school. You can't get everybody, but on some things you can get like 90% of people. And so, well, we need to do a lot more on messaging. We know, at least in broad strokes, that it's really important that when we're delivering facts, we're delivering them in the context of as broadly shared values as we can, and that we're delivering them through messengers that are as local, grassroots as possible.
Yeah, I recently published an op-ed on Stat about a very community-led approach to opposing anti-vaccine bills in North Dakota. And they said to start with listening, which I thought was a really obvious but fantastic point. Somewhat to that end, Carrie, you recently wrote about macaroni and cheese and local engagement. Could you tell us a little bit about that and the lesson that mac and cheese might offer here?
Sure. The story is about sometimes you don't always know the local context. So in this case, macaroni and cheese was made essentially with spaghetti noodles. And that is a simple example that you don't always know the context. I think the whole story of vaccine hesitancy is a great example of listening and how hard it is. Everyone who studies vaccine hesitancy knows that there are just many different reasons why people are hesitant. And so that means you got to hear what is it that's going on in this individual, and how do you address their concerns? Some of the people we talked with in qualitative interviews, they had complicated medical histories, and they had concerns about past reactions. So you need to be factoring in that there's not a one size fits all solution. I think that's the takeaway.
Well, I have about 30 more questions I'd like to answer or ask you all, but I think unfortunately for me, but fortunately for the audience, it's time to move on to the Q&A. So I'd like to start with Alita Meyer's question, which is, it seems to me that distrust in universities comes from the limited ways we communicate findings, e.g. peer-reviewed articles, and how investments in science have maybe not most benefited the careers of scientists and not improved lives. Is there any way to address those elements?
I can start on that, and that is that scientists need to be trained to not only communicate to their colleagues through journal articles, but they need to be trained to convey the value of their research to people outside of the scientific community. and what, as we fight against proposed cuts, significant reductions in the National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation, this is one of the things that I'm spending a lot of time talking to the press. And, why does it matter that we're funding basic research? Sometimes that sounds obscure, funny, and you never think it was going to be valuable. But then you look at some of the research studies, the work that Thomas Brock and Hudson Freeds did to discover an organism living in the hot springs of Yellowstone with it was about an $80,000 grant from the NSF. And without finding that there was life in those hot springs, we wouldn't have had PCR. We wouldn't have had the biotech revolution. We wouldn't have had many things, including even the ability to detect COVID, because we wouldn't have COVID tests. I mean, who would have guessed that discovery was so critical to PCR and really creating that scientific advance? And that's just not well understood by the general public. And I think right now it's a challenge.
I won't harp on this, but one thing that brought up for me that I think is really important, and there's an NPR article published on this pretty recently, I think this month. People just don't know where a lot of their information is coming from. People use a ton of publicly funded information like weather forecasts and, food safety warnings, product recalls, job market. And people are very, very protective of that information. People love their weather apps. They want to know the weather, but they don't know where that information is coming from, where the funding for it is coming from. Literally, if you ask someone where they're getting their weather, if you tell them the NOAA is going to be defunded, they'll say, well, I have my weather app, so what's the problem? Like, this is a major, major point of missing communication with the public.
So several questions have come up around this sort of similar idea, and I'll ask Ann Plants, which is, I wonder if it would be easier to engage more of the public in policy decisions based on science if more of the public had a better background in basic science knowledge. So I guess in some ways, this is a question of, to what extent do scientists need to meet people where they are, but people also have an obligation to know more? Is there a way to balance those things?
Could I jump in here? I think, if only for the sake of playing devil's advocate, I want to take a slightly different perspective on this. I completely agree. I think that question is very closely connected to the points that Toby and Emily made. And it's hard to disagree with anything that was said. And I myself spend a lot of my time writing about how wonderful basic science is. But I do think we have to reconcile with the reality that the scientific community has been making that argument since 1945. And it's never been very persuasive. I think it's waxed and waned in terms of its persuasiveness, but the real impetus for large-scale state investments in science have come from things like war, the Cold War crisis. I think that when it comes to trying to persuade the public of the value of science that's not obviously connected to things that they care about, I think there are two things that are important here. One, although there is in our current politics a radical attempt to reduce and refashion NSF and NIH, including lots of basic science, I don't think that there's lots of empirical support for the idea that the American public generally would like to see radical cuts to basic science. Those areas of science are not the ones that tend to show lots of distrust. In fact, those are areas that tend to be pretty popular. Astronomy is like a classic example. Everyone loves astronomy, even though it doesn't have any obvious utility, which is not to say it doesn't have any utility, et cetera. But that's the first thing. So I'm not sure that that's actually a huge problem, at least in the way in which it was articulated. I think it's reasonable for members of the public to ask whether $45 billion budgets are required to advance basic science. That's not an unreasonable thing to ask, right? Even if the answer is yes, it's worth it. That should be part of our political discourse. But the second thing is I would suggest that this disconnect points to the larger pulling apart of the country around educational attainment and institutional distrust. I think what we're seeing around that the second Trump administration has sort of mobilized into a politics has more to do with that broader set of institutional dynamics than it does with a lack of public awareness of the importance of basic science. And I think here maybe we want to differentiate between policy relevant sciences and those that are less so. And maybe this is somewhat traditional, but in the domains like astronomy, it shouldn't matter whether you vote for a Democrat or a Republican. But in domains where science is impinging on ordinary people's lives in really obvious and direct ways, I think it actually does matter quite a bit if institutions are politically homogenous, because homogeneous institutions are just not going to recognize the kinds of priorities and concerns of people that are not represented there. And so I think I would focus more on that problem than the generic issue of raising public awareness of the importance of basic science, as important as I think that is.
Emily mentioned that signaling shared values as a tool for effective communication can be really effective. So, what are 2 to 3 concrete ways scientists could do that in practice, and what communication channels exist for doing so?
I mean, I would just go back to, I think just something to note is that we have been talking a lot about what can scientists do. And we also need to be asking ourselves about who the best messengers are, because I think we've seen that putting scientists out there and saying, advocate for this policy is not a very good idea. It depends what we're talking about, of course, but the question of messenger is perhaps equally important as message. And I think what we know about that, at least as of now, with what information we do have, is that, of course, messengers that are close to people are the best ones. So if you're just talking about like the issue of vaccines as an example, you are not going to get better than somebody's own doctor. Like that is the gold standard of messenger. And we have to think about how can you scale that kind of communication? It's not easy to scale local communication, but to some extent, we're asking the wrong question when we're saying, how do we get scientists to talk about this better? Because we need to be thinking also, well, what should scientists be talking about and what should other people be talking about?
I would just jump in that also they should be doing less talking, right? So we kept saying listen, and we kept saying, and I've heard really compelling stories to, oh, we're all going to listen, and it lasts for 5 minutes, and then we start talking. The reason why people are saying again and again to go local is because trust is a relational concept, that it's built on human relationships, and it's easier to create that relationship with direct contact and repeated contact. So it's not just about messaging to people, it's about building, something real and human. And if it's at scale, okay, it's not quite the same, but you're trying to mimic that sense of direct human contact and building relationships.
I want to jump in here because I think there is a model that on localization of science that goes back to the creation of land grant institutions and the creation of the Cooperative Extension Service, where in every county in the United States, there is an office that they put an ag agent, they put a home economist to work with the mothers. I mean, remember, this is 1914 when Cooperative Extension was, and they created a 4-H agent who worked with the boys. It started as corn clubs because they couldn't get the fathers to change and use hybrid seed corn. They show the sons who were going to take over the farm, look at what you can do with this little plot of land, how much more you can grow. And they take over the farm, but they convinced their parents of how things were different. But it was local. And that local trust in the ag agent or in the 4-H agent that the people had, it opened the door to the universities, that many of which are AAU institutions, and that system still exists. And we need to figure out how to localize science in ways, and as I said, to overcome that divide, how do we reach out and listen? I've seen some universities, University of Missouri has done an amazing job actually using that system, not only to talk about agriculture, but to get out and say, what do you need? What are the local needs of your county and how can we serve them? And what information do we can help you? And the first thing is by going out and saying, we'd like to know how we can help. And I think that's part of what we need to really start to spend time on as institutions, to get science out there and localize it and personalize it to people who have misconceptions about what science is. The other one last thing I just want to say, because we haven't talked so much about, we talked about what scientists are doing or aren't doing. We haven't talked much about the role of politicians in politicizing science in ways we have not seen. And I honestly think prior to COVID, vaccination was a right left, it was far right, far left. That totally changed. And I can argue that that's because of the way it was politicized by politicians and people who certain people, depending on their ideologies, trusted. So worth something maybe we want to talk about.
I want to group two questions together because they're getting at something quite similar. The first is, how do we push to include an understanding of diverse values, the role science plays in policy, et cetera, as a required part of the scientific training process? And then the other one from Robert Frederick says, the suggestion that scientists take on even more training to become better communicators sounds like a burden many will say they don't have time for and would rarely practice given other demands on their time. So what supports need to be in place in institutions and in universities to help scientists better listen and convey humility and restraint, as mentioned in the article, in talking about science?
I just would say again, not that that's not an important question, but I just don't know how many people are getting their science information straight from scientists. And I really question how much that is the role of scientists. Not that we shouldn't be encouraging it, but I don't know that I am really sold on that as the solution. I don't think that on a large scale, people should be getting their science information straight from scientists. I think that's kind of the crux of the issue.
Can I jump in here? I think there's a another way maybe to think about this, which is that, well, I do tend to agree with you, Emily. Something that I do think we could do a better job of in educating scientists is making future scientists more aware of the diverse roles that they might occupy. Lots of scientists become research scientists, and the value of their being able to communicate with the wider public may or may not be all that important, depending on where they sort of sit in that research ecosystem. Lots of scientists become advisors. They go to work in private industry. Maybe they go into the media. They have different roles in which they are interacting with, representing, communicating science. And so those different roles have different responsibilities that are specific to them and different skills. And so maybe that's a starting point, is thinking about the different ways in which those who are scientifically trained are going to slot into different roles in institutions. And maybe it's more somewhere like later in that pipeline that we want to be thinking about the questions of diversifying values and being responsive to them. The other thing I was going to say is I wholeheartedly agree with everything that was said before about the importance of the local, but I also think to some extent there's low-hanging fruit here. To some extent, we're making this more complicated than it is. To take maybe a controversial example, if you have leading scientific institutions or publications endorsing candidates for president, for political office, it's not a shock that those who don't support that candidate are going to think that that institution is politicized. Even if that's an unfair view, even if there's an editorial separation between, commentary and scientific publishing, whatever, you're clearly signaling as an institution, we're aligned with this political party, with these ideas. And I would suggest stopping that as a fairly simple solution, without getting into the harder, more complicated questions of localizing science and embedding trust in face-to-face relationships, which I do think are hugely important, ultimately more important. But I think there's some low-hanging fruit that we could start with.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree and disagree. I mean, I think that every single person and every institution needs to do their part to stop this us versus them thinking. For those of us like me who are mostly focused on connecting with, the public over as a whole, this is not serving our interests. Or if our interests are to promote science, that's not going to help. But I guess the but is, in the long history of science in the science community, people enjoyed bipartisan support and they enjoyed keeping a lot of things kind of below the surface. And that time is not coming back, I don't think. So we also need to embrace that we are in an era going forward where we do need to make a better case for the value of science to society, and we do need a whole group of people who can be the communicators and the liaison between kind of basic research and public needs or other kinds of things. So it's going to take everyone.
I think going back to something that we already discussed earlier, just to, emphasize it, is people do need to see that science is important to them. I don't think that you can get around that. And if we were to be able to improve scientific literacy, scientific education, certainly that would help. It would undoubtedly help, but I just don't think that that is necessarily the most realistic goal. I think it's more realistic to think about, well, how do we communicate with the people that we have, where they're at now? And I think a goal of communication absolutely has to be just, how do you explain to people that science matters to them? And that comes back to things like, who funds the weather reports? There's really just, again, low-hanging fruit there that there's not really been a lot of urgency to communicate about, but it underlies the structure of everything else. And I think there's also opportunities. I mean, I live in Wyoming and I live in the community that the university is in, and I will tell you that people here, there's absolutely a lot of pride in like the research that is done into livestock, veterinary scientists, all of that sort of thing. And the more that you can make those kinds of resources that are coming out of your state, for instance, a point of pride and something that is serving the people of the state, people don't want to see that go. So kind of connecting different ideas here, but it really just comes down to, you do have to tell people that this matters to them, and it's not tricking them, it's bringing them in and sharing information that they should have.
Next question. My question is whether the panel thinks clearer communication about uncertainty would help rebuild trust. The literature on the topic is fascinating. My read is that acknowledging uncertainty can slightly reduce persuasiveness but increase trust.
I'll start, because I think one of our challenges, and this goes back to how we educate people about science, because I tend to think, as Tony said, I don't agree with the deficit models. Sure, just educating people or making them smarter on science isn't necessary. And the way we talk about science, we talk about it and we teach it in high school as if it's a set of facts. That's what we teach. And many people never make it past that level, high school. And we don't talk about it as a process, and that it's not static. There's a great article from during the pandemic of what does it mean to follow the science in a polarized world. I don't think we do a good job talking about that science is a process. We learn along the way. And during COVID, a perfect example is policies changed. People who are scientists flipped on their views, like mask wearing during the middle. And people don't understand how that happens, because we thought you were the people who were supposed to tell us the facts and the facts. So I think we need to do a better job explaining the process of how science works, and the fact that there is uncertainty and we don't know everything. That's what science is about. It's about learning what we don't know. And I think we've taken that for granted, and then translated into policies that were like as if they were the right things to do based upon what we know, based upon a snapshot of facts, based upon science at the time, but not where it would move.
It's 100% true that skepticism in relation to science on COVID and on any other topic a lot of that stems from people feeling tricked when things change. Like that is absolutely a core of where we see skepticism come from. So I couldn't agree more with you on that. And I think that, it's difficult when scientists are being used to communicate about or to push a certain policy because there's incentive to present things as absolute in a way that can really come back to bite you later.
Well, in just a minute, we're going to have to start wrapping this up, but I wanted to ask one very quick rapid fire question of each of you before Lisa Marginelli returns to us. And that is, what is a timeline that you think is achievable for reestablishing some measure of trust in these institutions? Is this something where we're talking about in 3 years, everything could be different, or is this a 50-year timeline? So what's your best prophecy for how long this could take? Tony, I'll start by picking on you.
Yeah, I think it's long term. And one thing we haven't talked about is we have the dynamics of distrust vis-a-vis the federal government now coming from the scientific community because of a lot of things that have been happening in recent months. So I think we're sort of entering a new chapter of distrust, not exiting the narrative yet.
Carrie?
I think the timeline really depends on our effort. So if we do nothing as we started, that means more than likely we're going to see our divisions continue to widen. But the opportunities for us is that, at least about half of Americans are kind of tilt positive towards science, which means these people you can build a deeper relationship with science and scientific institutions. So you have the possibility to do it. The other opportunity for us is because of polarization, there is more incentive than ever before for all of the branches of STEM to come to pull together because we are all in one boat. And so we have more incentives to collaborate together.
Toby?
Yeah, I would say we have to remind ourselves there are certain areas of science that have become very polarized, but there are certain areas. I still think everybody as a kid is interested in discovery and science, and we have to build off that and recognize, and scientists still enjoy compared to other I saw that, compared to politicians, the news media, many other individuals are still held in higher esteem than others. So yes, it's shrunk the confidence in science. In certain areas, there's questions, but we need to continue to build and again, listen to where people are coming from and do a better job explaining the science that we all support.
I want to thank you all. Thank you, Tori, Toby, Emily, Carrie, Tony. This was great, and we could keep on going. And in fact, we should keep on going. And so my invitation to you is to continue this conversation. Issues has been hosting this policy conversation since 1984. And we welcome you to join either by writing for us, sending us a note. We also have just started a LinkedIn group that we're calling We've Got Issues, and you can go to LinkedIn, you can find the group and let us know that you'd like to join. We were noticing how great the chats are here, and we wanted to have a way for people to continue that kind of conversation and exchange of information and views. You can read more of our work at Issues in Science and Technology, issues.org. We have a Friday morning newsletter that you can sign up for too. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Tori, for leading an amazing conversation. We will see you next time. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.